and welcome back to another edition of Recovery on Screen, the show where we break apart some of the great films about addiction recovery and what we can learn from them in terms of the nature of addiction and how to recover successfully. Today, we're going to look into one of the greatest films about alcohol misuse ever made, and that's Days of Wine and Roses, directed by Blake Edwards. Before he made all those funny Pink Panther movies, he made a very serious film, which is actually very important to watch, about the nature of addiction and how it affects couples in a relationship. And it relates to the chapter of my book, Addicted in Film, called Ménage Trois with Addiction. And to talk about that, I'm joined by a very special guest. That's coming up next.
People often ask, why does an actor choose a certain role to play? Why Joe Clay, then? Not a very admirable character, certainly. A man who's apparently compromised himself in his scramble for status. Fellow whose day very often begins and ends in a bar. And when it takes a boatload of girls to keep the client happy, old Joe's got all the right numbers. He knows just what he's doing, why he's doing it, and where he's going. When suddenly, in this woozy world of expense accounts, he meets the girl that he falls in love with. Now, on the surface, this would seem to be a shockingly sensational type of situation, but the qualities of Joe Clay's story are not that easily revealed. That takes a fine writer. And when I read this script, written by a fine writer named J.P. Miller, I knew that I wanted to play this part more than any part I have ever been lucky enough to play.
Hey, welcome back, and thank you again for coming to Recovery on Screen. I've got a very special guest today. Stephen Kind is joining me. Stephen, where are you dialing in from? What part of the country?
Oh, I'm in Mankato, Minnesota.
Mankato, Minnesota. Well, I really am so excited to be with you because, working with you and being a colleague, of course, is wonderful. We came through the Smart Recovery system. But also, I love that you love one of my favorite films, which is Days of Wine and Roses with Jack Lemmon, which is one of the classics. Tell me a little bit about what you do, Stephen, and what you're up to these days.
Well, currently I work for the Smart Recovery National Office. I am a Smart Recovery facilitator like yourself. I have kind of gone from being more or less the communications person to doing a lot of outreach, and am now serving on the Marcom committee. So things have progressed for me in my world with Smart. I'm also, like I said, a facilitator here in Minnesota, and we've got a group of meetings that has just been growing. So it's been fantastic.
Oh, that's great. I'm sure everybody thanks you for the service that you do for the recovery community with Smart or individually. And so let's go to the movie. Let's just dive right in. Why do Days of Wine and Roses, why does that movie speak to you?
Well, I tell you what, when I first saw it, I was absolutely bowled over by the performance of Jack Lemmon. I mean, Remick was really good, but I was used to the comedic Jack Lemmon. And as a matter of fact, I never saw this movie until about 73, 74. So I had seen The Odd Couple movie. I had seen The Odd Couple on TV. I had seen Some Like It Hot. I had seen a body of this man's work, but I had never seen him do a serious dramatic role before. And when I remember when I first started watching it, there was the big question mark, okay, when is this going to start picking up and getting funny? And he's got this scene in the elevator where he makes the face in the background. I thought, okay, here we go. Well, that never transpired, but it hooked me in. I remember as a kid thinking, this is not the guy I'm used to seeing. And it just got me to the point where I couldn't stop watching this movie, even though it was not what I was expecting.
Yeah. And what's interesting about it is that Jack Lemmon and his people at the time must have been fully aware of the fact that this was such a departure. As I said in the book, it's almost like Jim Carrey went from doing Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, and his next role was in Schindler's List. I mean, it was just such a departure for him. And So before the movie was released, they actually had him do an infomercial where he sat down and kind of explained, this movie's really important to me. I'm not going to be that funny. You know, this is something that's really sort of speaks to my heart, which is sort of like his way to hedge in a little bit of a way. To explain to his viewers that that was what's going to happen. But it paid off. I mean, like, you know, he was a serious dramatic actor, and he wasn't just known for the funny, although he was great at that as well. Now, in terms of like the content of the film itself, and you being in recovery yourself and being a facilitator for Smart Recovery, what were some of the aspects of the film that you thought were like really had the impact and usefulness for people who were watching this from the point of view of like how a movie like this could help in recovery?
Well, I watched this movie many years later, and it started to resonate with me on a personal level because I was in love with a woman back in high school, and we had our menage a trois with alcohol and drugs. Pretty much anything that came down the pike, we would both do. We had formed such a relationship that in our senior year, we decided we needed treatment. So we actually went into a treatment program together. For those that have not experienced that, it's not something I would recommend. We got sober. We stayed sober, I believe, a little over maybe 90 days after we had gotten out. But of course, just like you talk about in the book, the question becomes, will she slip first? Will I slip first? Will he drink first? Will I drink first? You know, how long can I hold off? How long can they hold off? And of course, the minute that either one of us decided to go off the rails, it was a joint effort. And the menage a trois picked right back up again.
Exactly. It is very much, and I also, you know, have been in relationships where alcohol was involved. And it really is, it's, you know, I guess it's called co-enabling, what have you, but there's that amazing scene in the film, which is just so, I related to so completely, which is where they've been sober for a while. They're on the farm with Kirsten's father, and everything's great and hunky-dory, and they seem to be more in love than they were before, and they're kissing and on the hay, like they're on a hayride or whatever. And she's, you know, he says, I've never been so in love or felt this stuff. And she says something to the effect of like, well, you know, I've only ever felt this way if we were drinking. And so that becomes like this little spark. And that's all it takes in when you're addicted to alcohol and drugs, is just that little entry point that she gives to him. And he basically runs with it. And then, as we know, chaos ensues. Is there another like scene in the movie that sort of spoke to you, like in terms of like giving some really crucial lessons about the nature of addiction, especially as it relates to relationships?
Well, the selfishness that's involved in that relationship itself. The same scene cut forward a little ways where Jack Lemmon is just losing it in the greenhouse. And it's not so much that he's losing it. It's that when he does find that bottle, he doesn't share it. He drinks it. It's his. Yeah. I remember my relationship. It was a cardinal sin. You don't do things without me being there. So it was an insistent triangle. It was not something that I was allowed to do on my own or she was allowed to do on her own. We were all in a group, the three of us.
Yeah, the three of us. And there's something very interesting also in that at the beginning of the film, Kirsten doesn't drink. She's very much a teetotaler. And this sort of like really almost enrages Jack, played by Jack Lemmon. I guess Joe Clay is the name of the character. Right. And that's sort of like, that becomes almost like a challenge for him to get her to drink. And he finally gets her to drink and they have a great time. And then it becomes part of like their whole thing, their whole marriage. She tries to stop, and she does actually stop after she has a baby because she's nursing, etc. And there's a scene where Jack, you know, comes home after like a really great evening. And do you remember the scene? Do you want to tell us why that scene is equal parts illustrative, but also kind of damning and sort of depressing at the same time?
Well, again, he's without part of the threesome. He comes back, she's sober, he's drunk, he feels like it can only be whole, if it's all three of them involved in the relationship. So I can relate with it. Now, I've never been to the point where I have pushed it on anybody, but I did absolutely not want to date anybody who was not going to enjoy the same things I did. The same woman that I was with, we got engaged, we almost got married. It was an alcohol blow up that was kind of the end of our relationship. So that should have been a light bulb above the head. But again, I continued to look for somebody to share the threesome with, not somebody where I was going to be that odd man out, like Joe Clay felt like when he got home and he was the odd man out. He was missing part of that threesome.
Yeah. And there's another interesting part of this, and for those of you who've seen the movie, if you haven't seen the movie, I hate to be a spoiler alert, but basically Joe decides that he just he winds up having these benders, and he winds up in an insane asylum, and he meets Jack Klugman, who we all love Jack Klugman. And he's like, I'm from Alcoholics Anonymous. And that was like the first time that Alcoholics Anonymous had actually been a star of a movie. And this was actually a huge, almost like product placement for them, which was good because, not a lot of people knew that was an option. So it was great publicity and a great help to people who are looking for help. But after he goes through that, he decides, and he does his testimony, he goes to meetings, and I guess he ostensibly goes through the steps. But then he discovers that Kirsten doesn't want to do that. And she has a couple of, pretty formulaic responses as to why she doesn't want to do that. Why, do you run us through some of the things that Kirsten says why she doesn't want to do it, and why you've probably heard that a million times when you go to people and your meetings, and they probably give you the same excuses.
Well, I can tell you the one that was personal to me and is often heard by me from people who come to our meetings is saying that you're an alcoholic or an addict, labeling yourself in that way. It's got the stigma base to it. It's almost as though you are giving up your identity and replacing it with what you have as a preconceived notion of what that means. Usually that means out in the alley by the dumpster with a bottle of wine. That's the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people. And I have always had an issue with that. Now, I've been through the 12-step program several times and relatively successfully, not real long-term, but relatively successfully in the period that I was in there. But that was always something that stuck in my craw, is why do I have to announce myself this way every time I open my mouth? And I could really relate with Kirsten in saying that she did not want to do that. So that was the biggest thing that hit home with me.
And also, I think in the same vein of that, she has what a lot of people have, which is this sense of pride that, like, she's not going to get up in front of those people. She's not like those people. Those people have a problem. I'm different from those people. And it's this issue that, like, people don't want to debase themselves by admitting this in front of other people. Yet they're the same people who will debase themselves by being the person who's drinking wine in an alley and, be the subject of scorn of people observing them, but they won't do it publicly, which is very strange and sort of like there's a total disconnect there, I feel. And also Kirsten says that when she doesn't drink, the world looks dirty to her. Now, and that is a very interesting, and I speak about that in the book as well, this whole idea that, and this comes up again in Beautiful Boy and several other movies, and Train Spotting as well, in reference to heroin, where life as it's presented to us, reality, is just not cool enough, hot enough, fun enough, or clean enough for some people. You have to get altered and able to enjoy it. And yet we're doing the fight to sort of make the opposite argument, that the opposite is true. Give us some of your thoughts about this and how you try to convince people that reality is not broken, because it's actually perfectly fine. It's you are the person who's broken.
Well, you see everything through your own prism. What you think is the best way to live is what you've been doing for How long? Until the other shoe dropped. That was your reality. That was where you felt comfortable. I make a joke about it when I do, the cost benefit analysis through Smart Recovery. I will tend to use the on the benefits of drinking. It was I could sing, I could dance, and I would fill in those blanks. Of course, in my costs of the same thing, I really couldn't sing. I really couldn't dance. And I ended up having to hear about it the next morning. So to me, my life was beautiful. I was a singer, I was a dancer, I could charm everybody. Well, once I got sober, I got to realize that, besides the fact I couldn't sing nor dance, a lot of the things that I was doing were less than charming. It's like finding out the next day what you did the night before. You thought you had this beautiful, wonderful thing going on the night before, and you find out the next day that it was anything but that. And then you're embarrassed for your own actions. So how do you take care of that? You go back to the world that you're comfortable in. You get that bottle back out, you get whatever your drug of choice is back out, and you start to search for that beautiful world all over again. So yeah, as far as Kirsten's take on that, I thoroughly understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and she's very interesting little sort of movie trivia that I also mentioned in the book, is that all three of the director, Blake Edwards, Lee Remick, and Jack Lemmon all checked themselves into rehab after the making of the movie at different phases. And of course, Jack Lemmon had a little bit, this wasn't well documented. A lot of people didn't know this about him, but he struggled with alcohol, and he had a DUI in the 70s that was publicized, and he'd gone through the program and gone through long periods of abstinence, and who knows how deep his struggles were with alcohol. But certainly, it was very interesting that everybody went into rehab after the making of that film. I think it's pretty telling. Anything else you want to say your favorite parts about the movie before we move on?
Well, I was just going to say one of the things that made me kind of taken aback back when I had first watched it. It was not this funny movie that I was expecting, but yet it had Oscar from the TV series and Felix from the movie in the movie. That was not funny. That one just threw me for a loop. I grew up, my brother and I, my parents called us Oscar and Felix. I'll let you decide which one you think I was.
Oh, I think you're Oscar.
You got it.
Well, it is, and this is one of the things I also mentioned in the book, which is, the use of humor and the fact that really ultimately comedy is really tragedy plus time. And, eventually we all want to be in a position like we're having a fun, jovial, almost laughing conversation about addiction. But I'm sure that when you were in it or dealing with it or in the cusp of it, whatever, it wasn't funny at all. I mean, it's a very unfunny thing. But over time, you get a perspective on it, and you realize that, there are certain aspects of it that are humorous, that there's certain aspects that are not, they're dark. But the ability to laugh at yourself, I think, is a very therapeutic thing to have, because it absolves you of a lot of the guilt. It's a way of absolving you of some of the guilt and making that go away and sort of washing you clean and letting you realize that you're facing each new day with a fresh, positive, sober perspective, and the ability to do the best that you can with what you've got, unencumbered by the past. And a lot of times I think it's the ability to laugh. And so that's why I think Jack Lemmon and all the other films that, like, for instance, a great example, Cocaine Bear. I mean, okay, so from a certain perspective, and I wrote a reporter from the New York Times and I told him about this. I said, Cocaine Bear, all right, huge hit in the United States, laughing at drug addiction, cocaine, really not funny, but the movie's very funny. And it's okay to laugh at addiction because there are aspects of it that are extremely funny, especially when the addict is a bear. who goes on a killing spree. So, so some people might disagree. They'd be like, all right, so Cocaine Bear, not funny. Cocaine Bear, extremely funny. Either way, my point that I try to make in the book is that any movie or story that talks about addiction, funny, not funny, serious, whatever, is an opportunity to have a conversation and open up about it. So to that, I really do appreciate you coming on to talk about this film, and thank you for being a fan of the book. And I'm still trying to hear what you think about certain aspects of it. Have you finished the book?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Well, I'm delighted. Thank you for the review. And for all of you out there, if you've read the book and enjoyed it, please leave a review on Amazon. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us on Recovery on Screen, talking about Days of Wine and Roses with Lee Remick and Jack Lemmon, a classic directed by Blake Edwards. And until next time, thank you for everything that you do for Smart Recovery, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to.